Hi, second grade. We are starting a new chapter book, and the title of our chapter book is Rosie Revere and the Raucous Riveters. And Rosie Revere is a little girl who was named after her Aunt Rose. And her Aunt Rose was a lady who lived in World War II, and she helped build airplanes. She was a riveter. A rivet looks kind of like a nail. It's a fastener that helps fasten together sheets of metal. And so her Aunt Rose helped build airplanes in World War II. And little Rosie wants to be an engineer and build things just like her Aunt Rose does. And Rosie and her friends are going to help her Aunt Rose design something that she needs help with. So our book, here's a picture of Rosie. Starts with chapter 1. Rosie Revere put on her safety goggles. "Are you ready?" she asked. "Ready," said Ada Twist. "Ready," said Iggy Peck. They were her friends. They signaled the thumbs up from behind the kitchen counter. "Here goes," said Rosie. She hit the big red button on the count-o-meter. A scratchy computer voice blared from its speaker. Countdown. 5, 4. She slipped open her notebook. 3. She pulled her pencil from behind her ear. 2. Suddenly, Gizmo flew into the kitchen and landed on the contraption. "Duck!" yelled Rosie. Gizmo chirped angrily. "I know you're not a duck," yelled Rosie. 1! The 3 kids dived for Gizmo just as, boom! The contraption exploded. Splat, splop, splurp. Sticky red glops of ketchup flew everywhere. But Gizmo zoomed ahead of the storm. She soared up, up, and out of the way. She looped the loop and gently landed on the refrigerator. "Zowie," said Ada, wiping ketchup from her goggles. "Yikes," said Iggy, wiping ketchup from his sweater. Said Rosie, tapping her pencil on her notebook. Rosie looked at the mess and wrote a quick note. "Testing in the kitchen is a bad idea." So here was their experiment that they were working on. And they have ketchup in this tube. And here it goes down a hose and it squirts everywhere. And the question says, do snakes like ketchup? Do you think they're trying to feed a snake with ketchup from a distance? And here it shows a picture of the results. Their kitchen is one giant mess. And there's Rosie and her friends Iggy and Ada Twist. And here is her little friend, the chick. Chapter 2. Ada and Iggy had been helping Rosie all morning. She was trying to invent something for her uncle, Zookeeper Fred. Uncle Fred had a big snake problem, and a little snake problem, and a green snake problem, and Uncle Fred had an every kind of snake problem. Every kind of snake in the zoo loved him. They slithered out of the cages and into his office. They hid in his desk, in his pockets, even in his lunch. One day, a smooth green snake named Vern hid in his sandwich. Uncle Fred thought that Vern was a wiggly pickle and almost took a bite. After that, Uncle Fred called Rosie. She invented a contraption to scare away snakes. She called it the Snake Away. It failed. She tried again, and again, and again. Rosie invented 5 models. They all failed, but she did not give up. Uncle Fred needed her help. Rosie had hoped that the Snake Away Model 5 would do the job. She looked at the mess. The fake snake on the table was covered in ketchup. It looked like a gigantic striped French fry with fangs. Uncle Fred would not like an invention that left ketchup all over his desk. He was a mustard kind of guy. And besides, it might attract ants. And possibly French fries. And here's Uncle Fred. and he's clearly got a snake problem. There's snakes wrapped around his head and his chair and his desk, and there's the little snake wiggling out of his sandwich. Rosie added some notes about her testing. Model 1 was a fabulous flop. Model 2 was a magnificent mess. Model 3 was a creative catastrophe. Model 4 was a distinguished dud, and Model 5 a ketchupy kerfuffle. The three friends cleaned up the mess. Then they shared peanut butter and honey sandwiches and talked about why the test failed. After lunch, Ada and Iggy went home and Rosie kept working. She looked at the contraption. A tube had exploded because a kink in the line blocked the ketchup. That means the line was bent and it couldn't get the ketchup through. The pressure of the ketchup had built up until boom! Aha, said Rosie. She jotted down ideas to fix the problem. Snake away, Model 6 would be better. She was sure of it. Well, she was almost sure. There was only one way to find out. She would make changes to the machine and test again. Rosie was about to start when she heard a familiar whirring and purring and clanging and banging and looked out the window. It was great Aunt Rose. Rosie stuck her pencil behind her ear, crammed her notebook into her pocket, and ran outside as Aunt Rose landed the Helio cheese copter in the yard. Hey, called Aunt Rose. How's my favorite engineer? Aunt Rose hopped out of the aircraft and twirled Rosie around in a giant hug. My new invention is a disaster, said Rosie. Brilliant, said Aunt Rose. Tell me about it on the way. Are we going somewhere? Asked Rosie. You bet we are, said Aunt Rose, and there's no time to lose. This is an emergency. Rosie likes to write down notes, and here she has some notes about gears. Gears are things that turn clockwise, like the hands of a clock, or counterclockwise means they go backwards. And things with gears. Cars use them, bikes, clocks, and cheese copters. Rosie put on her helmet, and Aunt Rose hit the switch. The cheese copter sputtered and twitched. It jumped, and it bumped, and it shot into the air, and off they flew. They zoomed over the neighbor's garden. Woohoo! That's a doozy, said Aunt Rose. Indeed, Mrs. Lou's garden was a doozy. She was a master gardener, and it showed. Each year she planted flowers and grasses to create a giant scene in her yard. This year her plants looked like a giant goose. Daisies, asters, and marigolds painted the picture. Tall, fluffy, pompous stalks completed the scene. They swayed in the breeze and made the goose come to life. Rosie looked down just as someone ran into the garden shed wearing a long duster, a big hat, dark glasses, and rubber gloves. It was Mrs. Lou. Rosie knew two things about Mrs. Lou. One, she was mysterious. Rosie never saw her outside during the day without her disguise. And number two, she did not like Rosie. Mrs. Lou never said that, but then she never said anything to Rosie. They were neighbors, but Mrs. Lou never even waved at Rosie. Once, Rosie saw Mrs. Lou in the window and waved. Mrs. Lou closed the curtains. Rosie had another clue. All the neighbors knew that Rosie was an engineer. They left recycling treasures on her curb. But not Mrs. Lou. She kept her recycling in wooden crates on her porch instead of the curb. She didn't want Rosie getting into the crates. Before we move on, I'm going to show you the picture of Rosie and her Aunt Rose flying on the cheese copter. It looks like they took some skis and they've got a propeller at the top. That's quite a contraption. So Mrs. Lou, as we said, kept her recycling in crates. Luckily, the recyclers Bee and Bo sneaked the crates to Rosie's porch when she was at school. Rosie was glad they did. The crates were full of gears and wire, tools and broken motors. Mrs. Lou didn't like Rosie, but she sure had great recycling. Aunt Rose steered the cheese copter up and away. Woohoo! Yelled Aunt Rose. I do love a fancy garden. Rosie looked back at Mrs. Lou's garden shed just as a pair of gloved hands snapped the curtains shut. And here's the mysterious Mrs. Lou with her big black hat and her glasses and her big coat on. Chapter 4. The cheese copter flew past the school and Iggy Peck Bridge to the edge of town. Aunt Rose pointed at an old white house with a wide porch. That's where we're going, she said. They landed with a thump and climbed out of the cheese copter. The house needed a new coat of paint, and the yard was wild compared to Mrs. Lou's. We're here, said Aunt Rose. You know, we talked about what a rivet was earlier, and here it shows you. It looks kind of like a nail. The head of it is rounded at the top, and there's the tail, and it's hammered into like pieces of metal and things to hold them together. Let's see where Rose and Aunt Rosie are. This is where they arrived, and somebody greeted them with a red hat on her head. Where is here? Asked Rosie. I have a better question. Who is here? Asked Aunt Rose. Just then the screen door flew open and a tall woman stepped onto the porch. She wore a red and white polka dot headscarf. It was just like the one that Aunt Rose had given Rosie. About time you got here, said the woman. Boss is getting antsy. What else is new? Asked Aunt Rose. They went into the house. The living room was faded but cozy. A set of old photos rested on a pump organ in one corner. They were black and white pictures of women working on enormous airplanes. A familiar face caught Rosie's eye. It was Aunt Rose, and she was young. Those are the Blue River Riveters, said Aunt Rose. The smartest, sassiest, toughest bunch of airplane builders you ever saw. And the best dancers, said the tall woman. And musicians, yelled a woman's voice from the kitchen. Stop yakking and get that girl in here, shouted another voice. Aunt Rose nudged Rosie toward the kitchen. Don't keep boss waiting, she said. They stepped into a large kitchen where 5 elderly women with coffee mugs sat around a well-worn wooden table. As Rosie stepped into the room, they all cheered, Rosie! Suddenly, Rosie felt embarrassed and overwhelmed. Her cheeks got hot and she ducked behind her Aunt Rose. Rosie didn't like being the center of attention. It's okay, kiddo, said Aunt Rose. They don't bite, except for Letty. She's just trying out her new false teeth. Aunt Rose slapped her knee and laughed out loud. Oh, that's a good one. And here it shows all of the ladies sitting around. They all have their matching red and white polka dotted headscarves, sitting at the table with their mugs of coffee. Aunt Rose laughed till she wheezed and her eyes filled with tears. Rosie relaxed and smiled. The joke was not very funny, but Aunt Rose's laughter was contagious. Soon all the women were laughing. Like Aunt Rose, they were loud and full of joy. They were raucous, and Rosie Revere decided that she liked them very much. The woman in the wheelchair cleared her throat, and the others immediately got quiet. Every eye turned toward Rosie, and a twisty feeling creeped into her stomach. Well, asked the woman, what are you going to do? Rosie looked around nervously. About what? She asked. What are you going to do about the emergency? Asked the woman. After all, that's why you're here. Here was a picture of Rosie, and she was looking at the photograph of her Aunt Rose when Aunt Rose was a young woman. So we're going to stop there, and we're going to see what emergency Rosie was called there to solve. So when we continue next time, we'll figure out what Rosie's going to have to do. All right, guys, have a good day.